It's shake and bacon.
Okay.
Well, I kept y'all waiting long enough. Let's tackle a chuck roll. The chuck roll is located in the cow's shoulder region, which is also named the chuck. Yes, it is a little bit confusing, but think about it this way. The chuck is Big Papa and the chuck roll is Little Baby. A 25-pound little baby in our case. It's just one of the subprimals found in the chuck primal. A shout out to our neighbors, the top blade, mock tender, shoulder clawed heart, and shoulder petite tender. They'll get to star in their own videos in the future. As always, I want to know if you have a different name that you call any of the cuts of meat that I mentioned today, so leave that in the comments below for us. And while you're down there, please consider clicking the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you. As we move down the cow from the shoulder towards the tail, the chuck roll flows into the beef rib. If we take a look, we can see that this side looks an awful lot like the chuck end of a beef rib. You see it? You see the connection? Last thing before we start cutting, we need to talk about size. This thing is huge. It's 25 pounds, like I said, and it's not even the biggest chuck roll that I've dealt with. And that means that we need to ensure that our knives are crispy sharp.
Duh, I know.
But the truth is that the bigger the piece, the more challenging it is to cut. There is simply more meat for your knife to work through. And it's not just about getting even slices, it's about keeping you safe when you're cutting into a large subprimal like this. You don't want to be trying to force a dull knife with extra strength that you might not have through a thick boy like this. Can you imagine cutting down a tree of this diameter with a freaking butter knife? It would be awful. Same deal. You want as much help as you can get from a sharp knife to make it through this. Now there are a variety of ways to break down a chuck roll. I do want to break down another one in the future using a technique that I saw while researching for this video, but today I'm going to show you how we cut this up at the store. So with that in mind, we will be cutting chuck eye steaks, boneless chuck short ribs, chuck steaks, chuck roasts, and stew chunks today. To start, the face is the end that butts up to the beef rib. It's pretty flat most of the time, so you may or may not have to slice a little bit off to flatten it up before cutting your first steak. I'm gonna say this is good, and I'm just gonna go directly into cutting. Now, if you've never heard of a chuck eye steak, it's because they can only be cut from this small little section where the chuck roll meets the beef rib. We're only gonna be able to get 2, maybe 3 chuck eyes out of this whole thing. And we could cut this section off and then cut that into steaks, but I prefer to cut them directly off the whole piece. And if you look, both ends are angled pretty much the same way, so we can angle our knife with the face of the chuck roll. We're gonna go with like 1.25 to 1.5 inches thick. Chuck eyes are sometimes called a poor man's ribeye. Now off sale, a chuck eye steak should be more affordable than a ribeye steak, but do keep in mind that ribeye sales can be better than chuck sales. Looks like we can get one more out of this. We were able to get 3 chuck eye steaks out of that. That's so exciting. And if you're wondering where the rest of the meat went, I asked Xavier to go put it in the fridge for me. We're not done, almost. There is a strip of meat right here that we are going to remove just by following this seam of fat. And we will put this to the side to deal with in a little bit. And then from here, we can just trim up a little of the excess fat that we want to trim up. Check both sides. I'm gonna cut this little tail off too. You don't have to, but I'm going to. And there we have one finished chuck eye steak. Doesn't it look like the little sibling of a boneless ribeye? Isn't it cute? And then just continue the same thing with the others. You could also pull this muscle off. This seam is really, it's not holding on for dear life, that's for sure. Last one. And there we have our 3 chuck eye steaks. This one is a little bit uneven. It's okay. I'm still gonna eat it. Putting these to the side, we can bring the pieces that we cut off back to our cutting board. Now, we didn't cut Denver steaks at my store, but we did cut boneless chuck short ribs. And this piece of meat that we removed from the chuck eye steaks is actually where we get both of those from. Denver steaks and boneless chuck short ribs are 2 names for essentially the same cut. We would refer to this muscle as the chuck cap, but a couple other names that I found during my research were chuck flat, chuck flap, chuck tail flat, the underblade, and the serratus ventralis muscle, if you want to get scientific, or sound like a country in Spy Family. And to make these into boneless chuck short ribs, we just need to clean up any of the excess fat, and then I like to cut them into little rib-like pieces. Just go ahead and do that. To make sure that I'm not gouging meat out while I am removing the excess fat, I'm making very shallow cuts while at the same time pulling my knife away from the meat. So it's a combo of cutting and pulling the fat off. Usually I would do it before I cut into the whole piece, but just make sure that you're also checking as you go for little pieces of missed bone or bits of silver skin that you want to remove. And then from here, we have this one long one and then these two short ones that are right around the same size. I just like to make them all about the same size. And they look really, really nice in a package that way, so I think that's why we would cut them like that. But there we have boneless chuck short ribs. This would fit so perfectly snug in a little 2-tray. Put these to the side. Chuck eye steaks and boneless chuck short ribs could be categorized as butcher's cuts, like a hanger steak is. It could be a little bit different if your store gets the serratus ventralis muscle sent to them separately, so then the boneless chuck short ribs and the Denver steaks might be primary merchandise cuts there. But for us, we would always get the whole chuck roll and break it down like we're doing today. I like to refer to them as byproduct cuts because they are a byproduct of cutting into a whole chuck roll for our primary merchandise cuts, which were always chuck roasts and chuck steaks. We even sold more stew beef than any of these, which is a shame. Beef back ribs being a byproduct of cutting boneless ribeyes is the exact same concept. This means that if you were to go up to a meat counter and ask them to cut you some chuck eye steaks or boneless chuck short ribs, you will probably be turned down. Because opening up a whole chuck roll to cut off maybe 20% of it, the store then has to deal with the other 80%, and that can lead to overcutting on their primary merchandise items, and then potentially just wasting product in the end. I'm gonna go throw these in the fridge and retrieve the rest of our chuck roll. Let's get this monster back over here. After the chuck eye steaks, I like to cut a roast or two here, about 2 or 3 inches in thickness. Roasts are so convenient to have on hand. I can cut them into chunks, I can cook them directly like this, I can slice them into steaks. Roasts are my go-to when I am being really indecisive on the cuts I want. Man, this is a really, really nice chuck roll. Oh, that's so exciting. Depending on the diameter of your chuck roll, if you have one that's a little bit bigger around like this one, you could go a little bit thinner on your roast, like 1.5 inches. If you have a smaller diameter chuck roll, then I would go a little bit bigger on your roast. It's just that the bigger the diameter of your chuck roll, you can do thinner roasts because they're gonna come out just as heavy. I like to cut chuck steaks from the middle section of the chuck roll for a couple of reasons. First, it's a little bit more manageable of a size because of all we've cut off of it already. Also, if we look, the fat that runs through the middle of the chuck roll is just a little bit smaller, which means that the steaks have a better chance at keeping themselves together and not falling apart because the fat has ripped apart. Also, at the store, if the fat running through the middle of a steak or a roast were too big based on, their standards, we would actually have to cut fat out of the middle of a roast or a steak. And that just looked really bad, and I really hated that. So I found that if I cut steaks from the middle, I usually could avoid that. I'm gonna try and keep these like 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thick. Pray for me. We very rarely cut thin chuck steaks at the store, and I'm not gonna cut any today because I have very little confidence in my abilities to cut 1/4 inch or less thickness of steak with my knife. And I would highly recommend against it for you as well, unless you have a meat slicer at home. And if you do, that's really cool. And I want one. Let's see how even I can get this. This is not super cute. I didn't like cutting chuck steaks at the store because I wasn't that great at them. Oh, this isn't that bad. Oh, that's not that bad. I'll take it. You know what I'll also take? A spot to put them. You see how fragile chuck steaks can be? That's like my biggest gripe. Leverage when it comes to really big subprimals is actually super duper important. You want to saw as least as possible. It is difficult with big boys like this. You're gonna saw some, and each time I do, you see me checking. I'm really just checking to make sure that my knife is still going straight and my cut is still going to be as even as possible. So that's why you see me kind of taking pauses between slices, or between saws, I guess, but that sounds gross. I'm not gonna lie to you, these chuck steaks are coming out better than I thought they were going to. Oh, this is exciting. We'll trim them all at the end. Make sure to, you know, be patient with yourself. This is a really big piece of meat, and I mean, I've cut quite a few of these, and my cuts still aren't perfect. So give yourself grace, let yourself practice, let yourself mess up, because you're still probably gonna find a way to make it taste good in the end. Don't be too hard on yourself. I have cut many an ugly steak. That's for sure. Neat. This is like one of the most even chuck rolls I have ever cut. I have gotten some really good luck on some of the pieces that I've gotten to cut for videos. After cutting steaks, depending on how much of the chuck roll I have left, I will cut roasts until I get close to the end of the piece. This is such an even chuck roll that I really could just cut roast through the entire thing if I wanted. Now, if cutting into the entire chuck roll like this makes you nervous, it's okay. It makes me nervous too. And I get paid to do this. The beautiful thing about doing this yourself at home is that if I wanted to, when these were, you know, still one big piece, I could have just cut it in half this way and then cut roasts, just smaller half roasts. Do whatever you need. Now, this end piece right here could actually serve as a perfectly good roast. I am going to do something else with it. It's just not every day you get such a beautifully shaped chuck roll that gives you beautiful pieces from end to end. I love that. I love that for me. But yeah, so this could be a roast, but I'm going to do other things with it, so I'm just going to put it to the side for now, actually in the trim container. You know me, I'm not usually one to trim fat, and honestly, most of these look perfect the way they are. I'm just gonna go back through them and see if there's any that I actually want to trim, but there really might not be. Like, that all looks good. At the store, they'd want us to trim this out, and then you would just kind of like mush the meat back together to kind of make it look as whole as possible in the package. But, you know, I'm gonna leave it that way. I'm gonna leave all these roasts as is, but this would be the perfect time to go back through, trim off any excess fat that you don't want on there. Same thing with the steaks, but I'm also just gonna leave those as is. I'm not gonna trim any extra fat off of those. To go back to the end piece, this is perfect for cutting into stew chunks. And to do that, all we're going to do is follow all of the seams, trim off excess fat, any silver we find, any grizzle, and then cut the meat into our desired size of chunks. Merchandising trim is just one of my favorite parts of meat cutting. Also, pretty much any and all trim off of a chuck roll, with the exception of, you know, silver skin, grizzle, any rogue bones that you find. Everything else, all the meat and pretty much all the fat, is great for ground beef. If you're going the ground beef route, I would still recommend separating the meat and the fat as much as possible, and that's just so that you can add back in the amount of fat that you choose. Whether that be 80% beef and 20% fat, or 90% beef and 10% fat. All you have to do is weigh up your meat, calculate the percentage of fat that you would like, add that back in. Before you grind, you need to make sure that the meat and the fat and all your grinder parts are nice and cold. So once you do that, throw it through your grinder at least twice, up to 3 times to make sure the fat and the meat get all nice and homogeneous in there. And then you have home ground beef with a personalized fat percentage, which is pretty cool. You might be wondering why I'm making piles of trim. So one pile is mainly fat that I will use to make more beef tallow in the future, render it down. And then the other pile is of either pieces of meat that are like super duper small, or pieces of grizzle, or just, you know, pieces of trim that have some meat still attached, kind of like that. And I'm putting them in a separate pile to use for broth in the future once I have a big enough stockpile of random trim pieces off of beef. The cool thing about this too is that you can do this and just keep the meat and the fat separate in the freezer, and then if you want to make ground beef down the line, you already have the two separated. You can always just run, like you could have run that whole end piece through a grinder too if you wanted, if you didn't want to do anything, you know, mathematical or, you know, scientific with you know, fat percentages or anything like that. You could also do that. No one's gonna stop you from doing that. Just make sure that you check for, you know, rogue bones before you throw it through your grinder. And the temperature thing still applies. You still should make sure that everything is nice and cold before grinding. Grinder pieces included. Xavier likes kind of smaller chunks of stew, so I'm gonna cut them maybe a little bit smaller than you would, but choose your own adventure. Cut them whatever size floats your boat. And that's it. That's all 25 whatever pounds of that chuck roll. All cut up. Hell yeah, love it. I'm gonna go ahead and put all of this in the fridge, and then when I come back, we will talk about cooking methods. Chuck needs time to let the intramuscular fat, aka marbling, melt down and make the meat tender. So just about everything we cut today is going to need a low and slow cooking method, like stewing or braising or slow roasting. I've never met a chuck roast or a short rib that didn't love a Dutch oven or a crock pot. Chuck steaks can be grilled or pan-seared, but they will need extra time at a lower heat to become tender. And chuck eye steaks are the exception and can be cooked exactly the same way you would cook a ribeye. If you're interested in finding out how much money we potentially saved by buying this chuck roll whole and cutting it up at home, keep an eye on our channel because our next video will be a cost breakdown of everything we cut today. And we will be comparing that to if we were to buy each item separately from the store. Now, if you're watching this video and that cost breakdown video is already out, then I will have it linked in the description and at the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching today's video, and thank you so much for your patience. I am deeply sorry for making you wait so long for this video. I hope you enjoyed and learned something today, and before you go, please leave us a like, a comment, and subscribe for more bartending and butchery content. And until next time. This is a beautiful chuck roll. Are you ready? Do I want to wear gloves? Do I not want to wear gloves? I don't want to wear gloves. Oh! Something fell. As you move down from the shoulder... Yes, it is a little. Flynn! You can 100% hear him. The chuck roll... Chuck roll meets the beef. BRB. Little rib-like shapes. I hope that makes sense. Okay, moving on. No, just kidding. The camera's gonna die. 1 second. And we're done.